Hello. I'm calling the meeting to order. Welcome to our UN Day celebration, celebrating the 73rd anniversary of the founding of the UN and the 50th anniversary of our Northeastern Pennsylvania chapter. Yes, indeed. Let's give that a round of applause. I am Elizabeth Seaman Bonzar, and I have the honor of serving as the president of the Northeastern Pennsylvania chapter. And we are traditionally begin by having a member of our local judicial system lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. And we have on our program Judge Munley, but unfortunately he's not here yet, so we're asking for Judge Margie Moyle Bizignani. That's right. Right, okay, to fill in for Judge and lead us in the pledge. So please come forward, dear. Please stand if you can.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Judge. You know, this year's National UN Day theme is human rights close to home. So we will have our guest speaker address that subject later. The UNA USA chapters across the nation will hold over 150 events celebrating the 73rd anniversary of the UN, and that will encourage community support for the work of the UN and its ability to find bold solutions to the world's biggest problems. In our program, near the back, there's information about how you can support our chapter, either by a sponsor of this event, being a sponsor of our David Wenzel Peace Fund, which helps fund expenses for our students here at this luncheon, or to become a member. Information about membership is available in our program booklet. We also have it here with us today. And if you're a student and you're younger than the age of 25, you can be a member for free. Today is our chapter, as our chapter celebrates our 50th year anniversary of honoring the founding of the UN. Our program fulfills our mission as we continue to educate our community about the UN. We want to thank our workshop presenters for our high school students that were here with us this morning. Joe Ricardo, please stand. Bob Savakinas and Dr. Letitia Morse-Lada, please stand. Thank you. They do a wonderful job. So our program will continue after we eat lunch, and we're being entertained by violinist Mark Wodiak during lunch. So thank you. Enjoy. It's time to begin our official program. I'm calling us to order, and it's my pleasure to just mention a few things. First of all, in our program, I have a date for Members' Day, but it's actually called the Global Leadership Summit that's held at the UN for members. The date is February 22nd in the year 2019. So it's an important date to remember, and it's a wonderful event to attend. You actually get to be in the floor of the General Assembly. Wonderful experience. Also, last night we had the pleasure to have dinner with our guest speaker, and he made a point to ask our executive committee what influenced us individually to become a member of our organization. Well, I got to state my mentor was the wonderful Dr. Marion Odell Carr, who was on the faculty, the speech professor at Penn State, at that time Penn State Worthington, now Penn State Scranton. But what I'd like to say to our students is, choose your mentors well. for they can lead you to wonderful places. Now it's also my privilege to introduce our chairman for today, who is also a very inspirational leader, and that is the Honorable David J. Wenzel. Now, Dave does not want an introduction, but there are a few things that should be said. Dave is the husband of the very wonderful Janet Wenzel. Dave is called the Honorable because he served as the 27th mayor of the city of Scranton. And Dave has a treehouse named after him. He has always helped his city, most recently helping to plant hundreds of trees to beautify Scranton. And he is our hero because although severely wounded in Vietnam, he has become a wonderful role model in continuing to make our city and our world through UNA USA of Northeastern PA a better place. Please welcome David J. Wenzel, the Honorable.
Oh, David.
Do you need any assistance here, Dave? You okay? No.
Oops. I guess maybe I did.
You got it.
Okay, that's good. Oh, wait a second. So you could talk a little bit.
No, Dave's getting set up. He'll be with us in a minute. It's okay.
Going to be the first time that I've ever given a speech in which nobody can hear or see me. What I wanted to do tonight is to look back over the 50 years that we've here.
Wait, Dave, can you
Okay.
hear?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Keep
All
going.
right. Okay. And looked over the last 50 years, and some of the people who have been here and graced us with their presence, and also came to talk to us about what their specialty was. And going back over it, in 1969, we had Clark Eschelberger, who was the first, who was the former member of the League of Nations that dissolved and became the United Nations eventually. In 1972, we had the ambassador from Nigeria to the United Nations. In 1975, Congressman Joseph McDade, who's only been in office for maybe about 12 years, would go on to serve for another 24 years as our congressman from the area. In 1976,
Lift your wheelchair.
in 1976, here, let me see.
Lift.
Okay, yeah. We can make a call. Yeah, wait a second, yeah. Put that over here. Yeah. No, that's not going. No. Yeah, wait a second. No. Let's see. No. Okay, here we go. No, thank you, we got it. We got
Look at
it.
this.
We got it. Okay. Oops. Nothing, we forgot it, we got it. There we go. Okay, holy mackerel. There's actually people out here. Anyway, in 1976, William W. Scranton, newly appointed ambassador to the United States by President Ford, was our guest speaker. In 1978, a memorial visit and talk by Jean Childs Young, wife of Andrew Young, newly appointed ambassador to the UN. he took over for, or her husband took over for Bill Scranton. She said it was a very impressive for someone who was not in politics herself. In 1981, Charles O'Brien, the first amputee to climb Mount Everest, was here to celebrate the Year of the Handicapped. I found out later that all he did is he lost his foot. That was it. Piker, you know? What can I tell you? Okay. All right, let's see. In 1983, Scranton resident Patricia Young became the chairperson for World Food Day. That was for the entire nation. In 1984, Frances Humphrey was here. She was an aide to Eleanor Roosevelt and had a lot of good stories to tell us. In 1987, Jimmy Connors will remember this one. Mitch Snyder, an advocate for the homeless, we had to bail him out of jail in order to get him here. And then, of course, we also had that same night, Kitty Dukakis, the wife of the governor, phoned in her speech that she wanted to give to our organization. And Jimmy, you remember that night, I bet, right? Okay. In 1989, Governor Robert Casey Sr. was our speaker. In 1993, Ingrid Washawataka, an advocate for Native Americans in North America and South America, made her presentation in Scranton, and just 6 years later, she was hacked to death by machetes in South America, pleading her cause. Yeah, some people have to do that. In 1998, Carrie Kennedy Cuomo, the daughter of Robert Kennedy and wife and the governor's son, was our guest speaker, and Bob Gownley remembers this. He picked her up at the airport, and she was as sick as a dog. We didn't think that she was able to go on. She went into his office, and she laid down in the corner of the office and said, "Just give me a couple of pills." And believe it or not, we took her over to the hotel where we were giving the speech, and she was as chipper as anything. You'd never know there was anything going to talk about a real trooper. Okay. In 2002, Roscoe Brown, World War II Tuskegee Airman, we had him as our guest speaker. In 2005, Dr. Robert Zaborski explained how he, on his vacation time during the summertime, he travels to remote parts of the world and performs operations of cataracts on people. And these are people who have been blind from birth, and some of them are in their 60s. And he does a 12-minute operation, and they can see again. Can you imagine doing something like that? Oh, brother. And then again, we have people who were right here from Scranton who made good. James Walsh, the former ambassador to Argentina, was a University of Scranton graduate. Lieutenant Colonel James Cummings, who was working for a cure for malaria at Walter Reed Hospital, was a University of Scranton graduate. And then finally in 2015, no one could forget the day we were introduced to Michael Soskell, a teacher who was runner-up for the year for the Teacher of the Year for the entire world, believe it or not. But he was the Teacher of the Year for the state of Pennsylvania. And what he did, he had his students, now this is elementary school we're talking about. He had his students contact other students in other parts of the world through the internet, and they would exchange ideas. And in one case, they had a bridge that had washed away over in Africa. And the people back here in the Wallenpaupack School, they came up with a design for the bridge and also came up with the money to buy the lumber to be able to build that bridge. And this is the kind of stuff that really, you know, it's invaluable in trying to reach out to people and spreading world peace. And now as I'm stepping down, I think this may be something that we should look into more seriously and see whether or not we can get most of our young people and a lot of our old people too involved in joining our operations. And we'll never stop doing that. And I have to say that it has been a tremendous opportunity for me, and also a touching to be able to work with the people over all these years. Thank you very much. Okay.
When do we want to give the awards? Now,
Yeah,
to Chris?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Chris, could you come forward?
All right. Always good. Okay, going back down.
Okay.
Okay, I'm just going to do this. I'm just gonna do that. Okay.
We have two
Go ahead, you can talk.
We have two presentations for our guest speaker today. They're both from the city of Scranton. One is The Key, presented to Chris Whatley, Executive Director of the United Nations Association of the United States of America, in grateful appreciation of his support for Northeastern Pennsylvania chapter of the UNA USA, presented on behalf of the mayor of Scranton, Mayor Cork. Congratulations, Chris. You're up. We also have a presentation from the Office of the Mayor in honor of United Nations Day, and I'll read the beginning and end. Whereas the Northeastern Pennsylvania chapter of the United Nations Association of the United States of America is celebrating its 50th anniversary UN Luncheon on United Nations Day 2018, Wednesday, October 24th. And the theme is coming together. This will be Chris's speech, coming together with those furthest behind to build an inclusive world of universal respect for human rights and dignity. So on behalf of that, the mayor has signed the proclamation. I present that to you.
Thank you.
You're
so
welcome.
much.
Okay. I have a brief, that's it for presentation. Thank you. But I have a brief introduction for Chris, so you know a little bit about his background, and I'll let
Sorry.
Dave get out
Yes, get out of
the
your way. I back it up, I back it up, I back it up, okay.
I live in fear of that thing.
I'm going to step in front of you, Dave. Okay?
You
There
go
we
right
go.
ahead.
Okay. All right, here we go. Okay. Chris Whatley serves as Executive Director of the United Nations Association of the United States of America, where there are chapters and organizations throughout the world. He represents us here in this country. He leads UNA USA's national staff in Washington, D.C. and New York, and heads up the association's efforts to connect Americans to the mission and work of the UN. He advocates for strong U.S. leadership within the UN and educates students about the UN through model UN programs. Before joining UNA USA, Mr. Whatley served as Washington Office Director and Deputy Executive Director of the Council of State Governments. Prior to joining CSG, Mr. Whatley served as Program Officer and Field Representative for the International Republican Institute, leading a wide range of international election observation missions in several countries in Africa. He began his career as a research assistant for the United States Institute of Peace, studying demobilization, and more of the detail of what he has done is in our program booklet. He's appeared on CNN, China Global News, MSNBC, C-SPAN, and other TV channels, along with being quoted in a variety of national and regional newspapers. He holds, for the students, He holds a Master's of Science degree in Foreign Service from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Government from Angelo State University in San Angelo, Texas. Chris lives in the Washington, D.C. area with his family. And seeing how Dave has already mentioned the presentation and our first speaker, our first luncheon 49 years ago by Clark A. Eichelberger, who was then the executive director, here we have on our 50th anniversary the current executive director, Chris Whatley.
Thanks, Elizabeth and David. It's a true pleasure to be here. As you know, this is the 73rd anniversary of the United Nations founding, and I can think of no better place to be than Scranton. This is my first time to be in this city, and as someone who is a longtime fan of The Office for a couple of different reasons. I think, first of all, it clearly belongs in the canon of American cultural achievement. But also, in addition to that, I find it to be a valuable cipher for understanding the complexity of the multilateral system. And to just give you an example of that, if you were to just binge watch season 1 on Netflix, and you were to have a copy of this document in your hand as you did so, by the time you got to about episode 7, you would already have found at least 30 compelling examples of violations of the 30 articles in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I'm not a lawyer, but if I were, the kind of CLE I would like to receive would be that kind of CLE. In all seriousness, I do think that this is an important place to have a conversation about the value and importance, the enduring importance, in my view, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to the challenges that we face today and going forward. And I think the question that I would like to ask of ourselves today is one where, when we live in this moment, where all of the algorithms in these devices in our pockets are driving us towards division. You know, everything that you consume on that device is causing you to marinate in your own convictions. That's reinforcing the righteousness of the positions that you hold and causing you to look at the other through a different light. Given all of that, given this moment, is it possible to reach a common denominator of human belief, a common set of aspirations for the advancement of human dignity? Can we do that? Well, what I would say is it was done once, and there's something that can be drawn from that. So let's step back in history a little bit. We know that this is the 73rd anniversary of the UN's founding, and the story of this document, which is about to be 70 years old, really begins in 1945. So put yourself in San Francisco in March of 1945 and think about where the world is in that moment. It's the biggest international conference that's ever been held. The whole world is coming together to negotiate the charter of what will become the United Nations. But what's happening? Hitler's still in the bunker. Every day from the port of San Francisco, 10,000 soldiers are shipping out. They're going to go fight in Iwo Jima. They're going to fight in Okinawa. The negotiations are held as the casualties are coming back from those battles. The institution that they were there to create, the United Nations, was created for the purposes of collective security, to create an organization that could sustain the peace of the war that was being fought at that moment. But all those nations who were there, 50 nations at the time, we got 193 in the UN right now, but right then, a world that was still under the banner of colonialism, only 50 nations. If you were to ask all of them what the obligations of that organization should be vis-a-vis the behavior of nations towards their own populations, I think the consensus would have been none. They were there to create an organization that would prevent aggression, that would forestall the next war that might look like the war that was being fought then. But there was a small minority of people, the civil society organizations, the church organizations, the unions that the US government had allowed to get accreditation to participate in those negotiations. Organizations like the Grange, a farmers organization, the NAACP, the CIO, before there was an AFL-CIO, there was the CIO, all of them were there. And they were pushing for an organization that would have aspirations higher than just advancing collective security. And at this climactic moment of the negotiation, so it's June of 1945, the war in Europe's already ended. The division East and West is already starting to pull apart because the Soviets are putting their own governments in place in those occupied territories like Poland. So the world's already starting to get more tense. They're wondering if they're going to finalize this charter, if they're going to even create the United Nations. But in that climactic moment, those civil society organizations came together. They cornered the US Secretary of State, who was leading the negotiations for the US, and pushed him to fight in the negotiations for the article that would create the Human Rights Commission. The mandate, the only reference to human rights in any meaningful way in the Articles of the UN, that would create the pathway for Eleanor Roosevelt and a number of other fantastic leading lights of human rights thinking to create this document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. One of the reasons I find that moment fascinating is Dave just mentioned my predecessor, Clark Eichelberger, the first speaker here. He's the guy who made the pitch. He went into the room with Edward Stepnis, the US Secretary of State. He made sure the NAACP spoke first. He had a Jewish organization speak after that. He had the labor guy speak last because he wanted to put it in the words of American politics for a Democratic political leader in 1945, and then they made the pitch. Without that effort of civil society organizations, including USA, Labor, many other organizations, you wouldn't have had this pathway to this document. Well, let's flash forward a little bit more from there. That's 1945. By 1946, when Eleanor Roosevelt is named to be on the US delegation to the Human Rights Commission, just the meeting in London where they're going to decide what this vision for the human rights agenda within the UN should be, she's 62 years old. She's the most famous woman in the world, but she's deeply insecure. I mean, she writes about it in her journals when she's on the steamer going from New York to London, that she feels like she's just been put on this delegation for window dressing or to add her husband's name to give an imprimatur to this effort. I mean, she's done so much in her life, but she's never represented the United States as a diplomat. She's never been an expert in international law, and she's deeply insecure. But yet she goes into those negotiations and serves as the moderating influence that could connect the dots between a world that's dividing East and West at that moment then. And also the wise light who realized that if you were going to create a to-do list or a universal set of aspirations for advancing human dignity for the world, you needed to ground it in something more than just the Western European tradition. So one of the things that she did when she was made as the head of the Human Rights Commission going into the next year is call upon the academic organizations of the world through the UN's academic organization, UNESCO, to canvass the documents of the global legal and human rights canon, to draw from Islamic law, to draw from Confucius traditions, to draw from the French Revolution, from our own founding documents as the United States, and realize that throughout those documents there are certain principles that are different enough in their manifestations in other places, but have common roots that guarantee basic aspects of human dignity, whether that's the rights of the individual, whether they are more collective rights and aspirations to things like education and things that would be part of more of a social justice agenda. And I think that's the wisdom that came out of this document, was ultimately creating a set of principles that are grounded in the legal traditions, in the religious traditions, in the moral aspirations of every society in the world. That's the reason that this is the most translated document in the world today. It's translated into over 500 languages, 193 member states, but think of how many small languages there are around the world. It has formed the basis of constitutions. I myself, first job out of graduate school, was working on the South African Constitution. This was a foundational document in that effort. It is also the standard in which nations judge their own human rights behavior and are judged by their own citizens, are judged by external parties. But was it a binding legal document? No. And quite frankly, we would have never gotten it had it been a binding legal document. It was simply a universal declaration of shared principles, a moral common denominator for the globe. And in fact, in those negotiations, that was one of the biggest divides. You had the British who were pushing for a true covenant, an enforceable legal instrument that would guarantee all of these rights. You had a separate effort to look at the means of implementation, to enforce that. There was no way you would have gotten that through the US Senate, even in the 1940s. But by creating this kind of moral document that could be given life to by individual citizens, by civil society organizations, that could find force in the constitutions of those countries who were going through decolonization, you achieved a greater outcome than you would have if you had pursued that kind of juridical course. So I think, from my side, that achievement has to stand on its own merits, to realize that even in that moment where you're coming out of the war, that you could reach this level of understanding. And it's important also to remind ourselves in this point where we feel all this division because of politics, because of the devices in our pockets, because of the challenges before us, those divides were even worse back then. I mean, it was the war that motivated the negotiations that got to the UN Charter. But it was Nuremberg that drove the negotiations that started the discussion around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So certainly there was a recognition that it wasn't sufficient to focus on interstate conflict, that World War II didn't really begin just with the invasion of Poland, it began with Kristallnacht before that, and that if you wanted a sustainable system of global peace, you needed to address human rights. But think about those negotiations. They end at the end of 1948. So you started with a sense of being driven forward by Nuremberg, but by the end of 1948, the state of Israel comes into an existence through a very close vote in the General Assembly. You had the Arab nations who were participating in the negotiations, pulling back as they went to war in what had been the British Mandate of Palestine. Those same nations were in the heart of the negotiations, and somehow they got to the finish line. So if the Universal Declaration of Human Rights can be born into existence, a common standard of humanity in terms of moral obligations, come out of that kind of firmament, I think it still has validity today. I don't think that the human condition has altered sufficiently in 70 years that the basic precepts of individual liberty, of aspirational rights that were clarified through a global conversation, canvassing the histories of all human people 70 years ago. I don't think we've changed that much since then. And I think that they still remain a relevant standard for dealing with a whole diversity of challenges, everything from Jamal Khashoggi to Colin Kaepernick today. So I think from our side, the question is more how you utilize these as an operational system, as a standard to guide individual behavior, actions of our government, and actions that we take in our own kind of ambitions and actions in our agency as individuals going forward. So from my side, I think the challenge is this. On the individual level, one of the best things that we could possibly do to give life to these principles, to recognize their importance for our lives right now, is to fight back against the algorithms that are driving our own division. I think that when we think about the challenges that are just driving the human rights discussion, whether it's Colin Kaepernick or whether it's Ann Coulter speaking on a college campus, both of those are examples of individuals in America feeling shocked by the other and pushing back against it, seeing speech that shocks their own conscience and rejecting it. I think that we as a nation need to draw examples from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, draw examples from the fact that the negotiators of it, hardcore Marxists were saying yes to principles that were being driven by people from the John Locke tradition and agreeing to them. If that's the case and that aspiration, then I think that we similarly can take comfort, even if we disagree with speech, in an example which is compelling and shocking, and I understand for much of the country when you see a player take a knee. And similarly, If you're a student on a campus today, and there is a speaker on campus who's speaking something you disagree with, you should protest it if you want, but we should welcome that conversation. I think that we're drawing into camps where we are shutting down speech from either side on things that shock our conscience. We've got to fight back against the algorithms that are causing us to marinate in our own convictions, to believe ourselves to be righteous in our own convictions, and failing to see the dignity and the ideas of the other. And much more we can do on that. Similarly, in foreign policy, our organization is a nonpartisan one. We're in a nonpartisan room here. We've got people from great different political traditions that all find value in the U.S. engaging in the one universal international institution. But the one thing that I would say in that, the one criticism I would have, is that we are increasingly choosing to withdraw from institutions because we don't like decisions made in them, instead of standing up and fighting for our principles in those institutions. For example, I agree with much of the criticism that has been leveled against the Human Rights Council over the years, and much of it that was well articulated by Ambassador Haley when she came to the Human Rights Council last year. And by the way, I think Ambassador Haley has been a fantastic representative of the country, and she's taken her duties very seriously. And before the U.S. chose to withdraw from the Human Rights Council, which they did earlier this year, I'll give her credit. She went to Geneva last year. She truly engaged in the institution, and she had lots of criticisms. One of them was the biases that the Human Rights Council has shown towards Israel. And I'll be honest, I view those as true biases, in that there is a standard agenda item on Israel. There's no other country-specific agenda item in the Human Rights Council for any other country, no matter what violator it is. So you can view that objectively and say this is a body of the UN that is providing disproportionate attention to one country context or one human rights challenge. Where I would disagree with this administration is that it can be shown empirically that in the 8 years of the Obama administration, where the administration chose to engage, the level of bias, the number of resolutions, the number of very specific resolutions against Israel went down, simply because we stayed. Israel faced certain criticism, much like every other nation does in difficult human rights environments, and you can still say that there was perhaps too much attention on Israel, but we can change the narrative if we show up. When we back away from the table, those same biases only accelerate. So, if you have convictions in your foreign policy, if you have priorities that you want to pursue, you only weaken those when you pull back from the table and choose not to engage. We're in a complex enough world where power is diffusing as we watch it to other centers of power like China and elsewhere, where we can't delegitimize a basic international institution like the Human Rights Council by stepping away. The rest of the world is still going to view it as a legitimate forum for human rights debate. All that happens is the alloy of discussion that happens there doesn't have the benefit of our political beliefs and experience. So you only succeed when you engage. And from our side, I think that the last point I'll make on this is that because of these important trends, I think that the work of the United Nations Association is more important now than it has been since the founding of the UN. I think that it is more important for us to play an individual role in advancing principles we care about, such as embracing the other in our personal behavior and being examples of that, such as ensuring that our country, regardless of which political point of view we come from, chooses to engage in these bodies that were built through U.S. leadership, that were built through Eleanor Roosevelt's leadership, that were built through bipartisan leadership from people like Governor, then Ambassador Scranton. We only succeed if we stay at the table, but in our political system, you only stay at the table if there are Americans who are willing to put their personal brands behind that institution. And that's what we exist to do at the United Nations Association. In the last 5 years, we've more than doubled in membership. 60% of our members are now under the age of 25. We'll build 20 college campus chapters in this semester alone. We're growing in places like South Carolina, in coal country in Kentucky. I think that there are people from both sides of the political aisle who may disagree on really tough issues, tough things, but can still find a place in recognizing that we're stronger as a nation when we step up to leadership, and that there isn't any wealth to be found in retreat. I think that we're in a moment where we as individuals can do more in our own communities to advance these principles by standing up for the other, by calling for our own local governments, our own institutions to advance core principles like gender equality. You can be part of the UN's mission without ever going to New York, without ever getting a passport. You're advancing the universal ambitions in this document when you drive those principles in your own behavior and the institutions you're part of. But at the same time, by putting your own brand behind the United Nations, by joining the United Nations Association. And if Eleanor Roosevelt were here, and that's what she did, she spent the last 10 years of her life as either chair of UNA USA or working on the staff of UNA USA. She traveled the country, and the first thing she would say is, if you care about this, join us. By joining the United Nations Association, by putting your brand behind this, it's a statement that regardless of where you come on individual points of the political spectrum, on individual divisive issues, that you think we should lead, that you think that there are certain principles that unite us in human ambition. You know, basic rights that you find in the Declaration of Declaration of Independence, that we hold dear when we say the pledge to the flag here. We're thinking about our own foundational documents as we do that. Well, those are basic human aspects of dignity that predate that flag, that are endowed by your creator, if that's your faith tradition, or just exist inherently in the human condition. And we've got a role in continuing to advance those. They're in retreat in places. We're seeing close allies kill journalists. We're seeing the democratic wave that was a part of my 20s in the 90s when democracy was on the rise and we felt like we had won the Cold War, and now the basic values that we had fought for in the Cold War were ascendant. We're seeing those retreat in places like Hungary, Poland. We can only push back against that if we as a nation are willing to show up, to stay in these bodies, to advance our principles, to stand by them. And that's a bipartisan thing to do. So I'm going to end there. I'd love to get anyone's reactions or thoughts, but I think we got work to do. I know that we at UNA USA are going to keep pushing. We're going to keep growing. We're going to keep reaching new demographics. We want to look like America, just like this room looks like America. But we also know that in our system of governance, we can't have a government that will stand by principles that are found on both sides of the aisle, that have informed our national security and foreign policy leadership for 70 years, unless individuals are willing to put their own brand behind this brand. Thank you.
Chris is willing to take questions, so please feel free to ask. Give yourself a minute. I don't see, you see a hand?
I would just have to say that in that spirit, Dave and I are sort of conservative, I'd say, and our dearest friend, Joe Ricardo, a true liberal. We see him constantly. We have wonderful discussions. We've never taken a knife out of the drawer, have we, Joe? we really do discuss current affairs and the New York Times paper on Sunday, and it's possible. Our other friend, Dick, where's Dick? Yost, the same. His viewpoints are entirely different than ours, and we're friends, and we enjoy each other's company, and we're able to disagree civilized, in a civilized manner. And I don't understand what all the violence comes from, because we consider them civilized, even though they don't agree with us.
Well, God bless Scranton for it. I mean, I was telling Dave, usually when I'm traveling the country, I'm the only Republican in the room that I walk into. But I think it's a great testament to the community. Anyone else? Criticism of the UN too? That's fine. Happy to answer those points. Madam?
Last night at the University of Scranton, the speaker was Archbishop Bernardito Auza, who was the United Nations representative of the Holy See, and he spoke the entire time on the refugee and immigrant crisis, and I was just wondering how you're seeing that happening worldwide and how you feel that UNA can have a part to play in that.
Well, thank you for that.
There's actually the Global Compact that was just created,
Yes.
and that's another, they're going to be voting on that very shortly.
Yes, there's going to be, the UN's considering a migration compact, which will be discussed in September of next year. Certainly, migration, refugee issues, these have become guardrails in American politics, very divisive, and not just here. You know, I've met with my colleagues from Norway and Sweden, places who we would think are extremely welcoming, but the huge refugee flows are starting to change the political debate in those countries. So that's another one of those things where you got to understand the other. If you're meeting with someone and they're worried about migration, they're worried about refugee resettlement, that is an honest opinion. But what I would say to it is, you know, there's 65 million refugees and displaced people in the world right now. The question isn't, do we resettle 30,000 here or 100,000, as the Obama administration wanted to? The question is the 65 million. And that problem only gets solved by resolving the conflicts that's driving them.
That's right.
So the UN is essential for that. If you're worried about the big flows, then you need to be worried about resolving the conflict in South Sudan, which is one of the biggest drivers, Syria before. There's actually more refugees globally coming out of South Sudan than Syria right now. And you also need the humanitarian capacity that the UN system offers. That you know, of those 65 million, over half are under the age of 18. Less than 25% have access to primary education. So one of our big priorities in UNA USA has been to try to increase support for education access in refugee camps. To me, I think that should be a bipartisan priority, because whether you believe in more refugee resettlement in the United States or less, it doesn't serve anybody's interest if you spend 10 years in a refugee camp with no education access. You're subject to radicalization, to human trafficking. That's not in anybody's interest. So I think there's, even in the refugee question that is divisive, there's much work to be done. Migration is going to be a bigger challenge. That I think migration flows globally are only going to increase. And so all of these kind of tenets of politics that are so divisive are going to accelerate. And I don't know where it goes. I know that the US will not participate in that migration agreement, but at some point, we ourselves are going to have to, you know, look at our own migration policies in a new light, in some way, one way or the other. Other points?
With 193 nations subscribing to the precepts of the United Nations, how can that effectively been implemented when you have that veto in the Security Council?
The question is, with 193 member nations, but only 5 having a veto, how is it effective in its work? And, you know, the world, or at least the American public, I think, to the extent that they think about the UN, you judge it on what happens in the Security Council. So you see an open wound in Syria, you see a Security Council that can't reach consensus, so there's a failure to act in Syria. You're going to have those failures. And I don't think that you're going to have basic Security Council reform in my lifetime. But meanwhile, while all that is going on, you had the UN intervene in Mali to push back against an al-Qaeda takeover of that nation. You know, al-Qaeda took over a country in North Africa called Mali that we don't think about. The French pushed out the al-Qaeda insurgency, and then the UN came in thereafter, held elections, now has a big peacekeeping presence, keeping al-Qaeda from coming back. And in fact, in the In the months in which they were in control of Mali, they used it as a staging ground to kill American energy workers in Algeria. This is a success. To me, this is a success that happened through the UN system. Security Council had to approve it, but it's Mali, so we're fine with the Russians and the Chinese in terms of what the priorities should be there. But it's off the headlines. And if we take that big building in New York, as some opponents of international cooperation think, and push it off into the East River and have it float off into the Atlantic, and have the new institution rebuilt in Beijing, which is where it would be, you don't get that kind of outcome. So I think from our side that we have basic national security interests that get advanced at the UN even if we don't think about them.
Anyone else? I would like you to address the concept of the collegiate chapter and tell us about that.
Great.
Because we have many colleges here, also in the Wilkes-Barre area.
Great. Well, I would say if you're in college or you're going to be there soon, 5 years ago we had no college chapters. That we had fantastic chapters like the one that we're here for, but we decided to open up an effort to create official college organizations, really trying to get them recognized as campus organizations, because once you are at most universities, you can tap into travel funds to go join us in New York for our Global Engagement Summit or to join us in Washington for the Leadership Summit. We have internship opportunities, often with UN agencies that sometimes we can connect you to. So I would say if you're interested in creating a college campus chapter, I have a whole team in Washington that goes on the road on those, but we've gone from 0 chapters 5 years ago to 113 on campuses now.
Anyone else with a question? If not, oh, go ahead.
Bob?
Yeah.
Actually, I don't have a question. I just want to do a follow-up just for a second, if
Yep.
I may. I was one of the presenters with our students, and I think our students, because of all that great interaction and their interest and love of what's going on in the world, they and their teachers deserve a round of applause right now. And thank you, Mr. Wiley, for coming here to speak to us.
Thank you.
So, as president, I get to say a few closing remarks. First of all, a big thank you has to go out to our, of course, benefactors, our committee, and you all know who you are, and it's in our program booklet. Of course, Dave and Janet, because behind the scenes there's much that they do. And it has been a great honor to have such a special guest speaker on our 50th anniversary. Thank you, Chris. I want to thank you all for attending today and for all of your support over the last 50 years. It has been a good run for our chapter and an organization Scranton can be proud of. We will see you hopefully next year on October 24th, because that's our day, and we ask you to go and make our community and our world a better place. Thank you. Well done, guys. Well done. Whoa.